So I am Ruth Banzovich, the Church Engagement Director here at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. Our speaker today is Dr. Peter Bussey, who's a particle physicist and an honorary research fellow in the School of Physics and University at the University of Glasgow. He's a fellow of the Institute of Physics and Sheffield University and CERN. He's been involved in research with several international particle physics collaborations, not least in CERN in Geneva, which you'll have heard of, but also the Fermilab in Chicago and all sorts of places. He's been a regular contributor to the Christians in Science online journal, Science and Christian Belief on Science and Religion, as well as a number of others. And in 2016, he published a book called Signposts to God, and Modern Physics and Astronomy Point the Way to Belief. But today, he's going to be speaking about natural law, God's law in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to talk today about not so much the laws of physics, but about the laws which should govern human behavior. Natural law is really the sense of right and wrong, which everybody has or should have in their own experience. And nobody has actually put this better than the Roman philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero. He wasn't a Christian, of course. He was too early for that. He was a Stoic philosopher. And he wrote, "There's a true law, a right reason, conformable to nature, whose commands are just to duty, and whose prohibitions restrain us from evil, did not one thing in Rome, another in Athens, but at all times and nations must forever reign. God himself is its author. He who prays it not flies from himself, does violence to the very nature of man." Now that basically sums the subject up. And I want to fill in lots of details about what he was referring to. Now, more recently, C.S. Lewis was a great believer in natural law. He believed that there are basic moral principles which are similar in cultures throughout the world and over history. He, of course, had a great deal of knowledge that Cicero didn't have, but it's the same message. And C.S. Lewis made a collection of various examples of what he was referring to. Here they are. There are many more that he could have collected, but in his book, The Abolition of Man, this is what he came up with. First one, respect parents, don't murder, don't steal, don't lie about others, don't commit adultery. Ancient Jewish. You will, of course, recognize all this as part of the Ten Commandments. Don't slander others. Don't hurt others with your words. Don't cause people to suffer. Go with Babylon, Hindu, Egypt, caring for parents in ancient Greece, and also native North American. Those who had affairs with other people's wives and North concern, no trickery or false earths, Anglo-Saxon, ancient Chinese, more from ancient Egypt about stealing, and about the ancient Babylonian code of conduct. And you could collect a lot more about this, that human beings around the world throughout history have had a broadly similar collection of moral principles which seemed obvious to them. Well, in the Middle Ages, the philosopher who spelled out a lot of this and whose work we depend on quite a lot was Thomas Aquinas. And he said there are three areas of natural law, and these are implanted on nature by God, and they are universal. First, physical laws. So he put down physical laws of physical nature, And then he moved on to animals and said that animals have a higher and different set of laws that help them to operate. And there are also, finally, human beings. We are another special case, but we do actually share in animal nature. That has to be remembered. So what do? We rationally discern objective good and evil, which means that these are principles that when you think about them are reasonable. Also, having discerned good and evil, we know that we ought to do good. We ought to avoid evil. So the perception and the obligation are separate things, and they're both there. And we refer to conscience, which is something which tells us what we should or shouldn't do. Also, it's both individual and societal, because we are beings who live in societies, and societies can have basic ways of operating which are good and bad, and we should recognize. What makes things go wrong? According to Thomas Aquinas, we have disordered appetites, and they lead us astray, and we follow them instead of the true principles of right and wrong. And because we're ignorant about things, we also need scripture to guide us. So this again sums things up fairly well, but people have argued about all of this. So to sum Aquinas up, he had a concept of well-functioning human nature. I don't know that he used the phrase, but it comes out of everything he wrote. He said that a moral law is present in us, and it's attuned to our human nature. God has put it there, and it points to what is good. So we ought to know what is good, what is bad, and what to do. It doesn't always work well, but that's how it ought to be. And most of us have this sense, good and evil, bad and good, and what we should do. But there have been a lot of questions put about this claim, because there are people who are skeptical and people who just want to just ask in more detail. First, is there really such a thing as absolute objective moral law? It's a fair enough question, and people have doubted that. Another thing is that Aquinas imagined God as creating human beings perfect some thousands of years ago. But we now have a scientific viewpoint. We believe in evolution. And so how did morality come to be? We don't really consider animals as being subject to morality. There are philosophers who disagree with that, but most of us wouldn't. In other words, if the cat steals the fish, we don't say that the cat really is being immoral. We just say bad cat, but that's just the way we talk. It's really the way that cats work. So at what stage in evolution can we really talk about morality? And indeed, if there is a set of principles that apply to everyone, and it's to do with well-functioning human nature, is there really such a thing as human nature? We have to ask that. Well, there are basically 3 points of view here, and philosophers put in a lot of other detailed points of view, but this is what it amounts to. At the top left, you'll see a picture of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And he didn't believe really in moral values at all. He didn't believe in bourgeois morality. He didn't believe in Christianity. He did believe in the will to power. So that's one point of view, that people can be completely skeptical, but just live whatever way is comfortable. Top right, you'll see a whole lot of people who are marching together in step. So that, I think, illustrates a very common point of view, which is that morality is about social convention. people just decide that it's easiest and nicest if people just walk in step with each other. If you've got a very diverse society, this becomes problematic, and there are arguments. But this is a very standard viewpoint. Or these things are God's wishes for us. They are absolute. There's an absolute authority, a higher authority, and God has communicated these principles to us, either directly into our hearts or else, if necessary, through prophetic voices. Here is Moses giving the Ten Commandments, but people should have been aware of most of this already. Now, I don't often agree with Richard Dawkins, especially in his book, The God Delusion, but he did actually make a very good point. He said, and I agree, it is pretty hard to defend absolutist morals on grounds other than religious ones. If you haven't got a higher authority, then where do your absolute principles come from? And this is what I should be basing the rest of the discussion on. So I'm assuming that, amazingly, Dawkins was right, and that we are talking about something which comes from God, as indeed Aquinas and Cicero would have said. So, to say stock, we are spiritualized physical beings with a moral sense. The claim is that God has set this in us. It's in principle universal and reliable. We may indeed have personal social drives and pressures, but objective moral value is another quantity. And without God's authority, the best we can do is say that we have social customs and social traditions, but there's no absolute ought. So if you have a society like maybe we have, if you can get away with behaving antisocially, why not? It's logical. You just have to make sure you keep your friends, please the neighbors, and stay out of jail. Well, there are probably people just like that. Now, here's a point which I think we need to remember, which is that there are unbelievers who still possess moral laws, humanists, for example. Now, humanists can be very moralistic. We as Christians can say that these humanists actually do have, at a certain level, God's law in their hearts. They, however, can't justify that. We can, but they can't. They don't have any real warrant for this. So there can be a debate with them on this basis. So let's start to ask about who we are. And here are two prominent figures, C.S. Lewis again and John Paul II. Now, one thing that both of them agreed on was that you shouldn't be too separatist about mind and the body. We are united beings. We are unified. And C.S. Lewis said that if you try to separate the mind and the body too much, then you have a mind and you have appetites with nothing to join them together. He said you would have men without chests, which is a phrase he used in his book. The heart seems to be missing. Pope John Paul talked about spiritualized matter. He said we are personal beings. The body is important. It's not merely the slave of the mind. So here are two, I think, important points of view to bear in mind, that we should think of ourselves in a very unified way and not just dismiss the body or whatever. Now, the key problem to talk about now is the question of animals and humans. And as I say, if the cat steals the fish, you don't really blame the cat. You keep it out of the kitchen in future. Chimpanzees can be pretty nasty to each other. A chimpanzee can eat the offspring of another chimpanzee. A lion can eat cubs from another lion. This has some kind of evolutionary function in that the strongest animal has its own offspring passed on to the next generation. But there's no morality here. It's just a behavior pattern. But to contrast this, I showed a picture of Mother Teresa, who had moral awareness, not, of course, the only moral aware person, but she typifies a high level of moral awareness as compared with the wretched chimpanzees. Even though they might behave quite well sometimes, they don't really have morality. And Darwin was well aware of this. He was a very honest scientist. He was advocating his own theory, and he knew that he would have to answer all sorts of questions, which he did his best to do. He said, I fully subscribe to the judgment that of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense or conscience is the most important. So, yes, he was right. He did try to produce some kind of explanation for how things happened, but I don't think he was very successful. He basically said that the pragmatic practices can develop, which may well be true, but he didn't really deal with the actual moral sense or conscience. He just talked, I think, about the things that people learn to do. Now, people have tried to investigate whether young children have a moral sense. There's some evidence that they perhaps do. This comes from a page from the New Scientist. I'm not going to read all that, but the message was that this bit of research seemed to suggest that even very young babies have some sort of what is morally right and wrong. And there have been other tentative pieces of research which seem to hint about something of the kind. I think it's all very tentative, but at least the research has been attempted. Well, let's go back to animals. Now, the top left, you see what is surely just genetically determined. You have a male peacock, he sees an attractive female peahen, and then he behaves the way that peacocks behave. And I doubt if there's much thought going into his mind. That's just the way that peacocks behave. But you have other animals who work in groups, and it would seem that they learn from each other. The young wolf will have to learn a bit from the older wolves. And if you try and take a wolf out of its pack and bring it up, that's not very easy. It doesn't behave like a wolf anymore. It's not a very successful exercise, people have found. Now, if you look at the way that species develop, advanced species really, it would seem to be rather difficult to separate these two things, because the way that the genes have developed will interact with the way that the social patterns develop, and that in turn may have some effect on how the genes develop. It's not simple, and both elements really should be seen as present. In other words, we shouldn't be talking about complete genetic determinism. People do, but they shouldn't. We shouldn't be talking about blank slates. Again, people do, but they shouldn't. It's somehow or other a combination. Well, birds, for example, the young bird has an inherited ability to sing, but the songs that it sings, it will learn from the parent birds. So that's a simple example, but this is in fact not a simple situation. It is quite complex. So let's now think about humans. This again is ongoing research. But people decided that about 2 to 4 years ago, a million years ago, there was a species called Australopithecus. Lived in Africa and was rather ape-like, but with some human tendencies. But as the years went by, a more human-like species developed, hominins, as they're referred to, let's say around 2 million years ago. And these human-like features were able to use tools and fire. They weren't quite the same as our final development, but they were certainly a lot more human than they were like apes. At the bottom, there's a Gibraltar coin, which is about Neanderthals. So it's a Neanderthal skull found in Gibraltar. The Neanderthals moved away from Africa. They were somewhat like us, but not completely. Now, at the top right, you see from a German museum their reproduction of what they think Neanderthal would look like in a modern business suit. Now, you might be a little bit surprised if your bank manager looked like that, but not totally impossible. It would be a bit surprising. But the Neanderthals interbred with the more true humans, and we've probably all of us got some Neanderthal genes in us. And finally, bottom right, those rather nice-looking people are sand people from southern Africa, and they are Homo sapiens. They look like other Homo sapiens, look like us. Probably the first Homo sapiens wouldn't have all the ornaments and jewelry, but it's believed that they are the most directly identified group that evolved from the previous hominins. So what happened after that? Well, there were migrations of humans out of Africa, and the later migration was to all the rest of the world. Now, I've written down some numbers. These numbers keep changing because more research is done, but it's not critical for the present argument. So it may well have been 70,000 years ago that the second wave of migration occurred. That's not that important. And you've got what is called the Middle Paleolithic, where there were tools, the axe heads and things like that, made from very standard patterns. They didn't do anything very original. Once they got a design for an axe head that worked, they kept on doing it like that for a very long time. And the picture just illustrates these researchers' understanding of how the later Homo sapiens moved all over the world. The Upper Paleolithic, that is more recent. Now, they had advances in art, various techniques, and body ornaments, and perhaps there are suggestions of religious awareness. So, from that point of view, something seemed to have happened between the Middle Paleolithic period and the Upper Paleolithic period, and that's noteworthy. Well, what do modern anthropologists do? They try to identify groups of people who don't seem to have changed very much in their habits for a very long time. And they study what these people do, and they try to say that this tells us about very ancient human beings. They may or may not be right, but this is the kind of thing they attempt. So at the top left, you've got some Inuits from northern Canada. Top right, you've got some Amazonians. Bottom left, you've got some pygmies from Africa. And bottom right, you've got some folk from Papua New Guinea. Now, these people may dress very differently, and the pygmies are somewhat shorter than many others, but they are all Homo sapiens. They're all our cousins from around the world. They're like us, except for these superficial differences. But they may very well have different social customs, or maybe they don't. The anthropologists will try to study these people and try to find out about common factors, which they can then try to identify as human universals and something about human nature. So this is the attempt to search for human nature. I think it gets harder and harder because, of course, modern technology and modern people, modern medicine, everything modern is influencing all these people now. So it may well be that the research that has been done already has done most of what has been possible to do. However, the ancient studies with axe heads and various artifacts do give some limited evidence of an ancient human culture. And it's hard to avoid the conclusion that social norms have always existed. Now, modern anthropology studies all of these. Here are a couple of names of well-known anthropologists, and they have identified hundreds of social and behavioral features that may broadly be called human universals. Now, that is not to say that every tribe is exactly the same as every other tribe. That isn't quite true. But you can identify features which are very commonly held and say, well, sometimes the tribe diverges a bit, and that's inevitable. Now, some of these we may regard as morally relevant, others not. So these, you might say, can indicate both a cultural and a biological inheritance. I think that's a good question, but let's say that both are no doubt present. And here's a list of lots of things that the anthropologists would point out as being very common around the world. Language, kin groups, music, poetry, rights, obligations, etiquette, rituals, taboos, moral sentiments, property rights, and many others. And all of this, one could say, is adds up to something like human nature. On the left, you see an Indian musician. On the right, we see some musicians from Lapland, I think, just as an illustration. So people around the world, once they get to understand each other a bit, can talk to each other. We're all of us human, but with certain local variations, but lots and lots in common. So having studied all that, as I said, the anthropologists and the paleontologists don't have any problems in discussing social norms. There are things that they find that societies do. And as I've just suggested, it's quite reasonable to see human nature in these observed human universals, as C.S. Lewis would doubtless have said. However, while many of these seem to align with Christian moral perceptions, others don't. So the idea that you should respect other people's property seems very sensible and also quite moral, we would say. Many other things. But there are other things such as xenophobia, pretty common, and revenge, pretty common, honor killings, even abducting young women, which you can find in various parts of the world, at least with the more, the less developed tribal groups. Now, these we would not say were very good examples of morality. So there's a question here. There may well be something called well-functioning human nature, and we may say, well, take best in all of these, but is this perhaps an ideal? Has it ever been a reality? So I've argued that with others, that a moral disposition is real. It's not just a question of local customs. And it's more than just social norms. It's something qualitatively new and different, just as Darwin pointed out. So how did we come to have this factor? Now, at this point, I'm going to make a clearly Christian proposal, which isn't original. It would be, I think, agreed with by Jewish thinkers. And it is like this, that if we're going to say that authentic moral reality is God-based, then God has to give it to us. There's no particular reason to believe that this extra factor just comes about. Why should it? It's something new. So I would suggest that at an early point in our history, God acted and uplifted the newly evolved humans to a new level of spiritual awareness and partnership. And you may well say that this was the time when creation was finished. What did this do? It resulted in these somewhat bumbling hominins becoming true human beings. It gave a truly well-functioning human nature at that time. It provided objective moral values individually and communally. So the individuals behaved well and they had a good societies. But then, since we are unfortunately well aware that human societies and people aren't like this, you will have to say that this partnership has become degraded. What was produced in us is the so-called image of God. And we'll see in a few minutes that this is a perfectly biblical concept. And maybe rather soon after the original spiritual awakening, we should be aware of an incursion of evil. So this is not a practical thing to talk about, but if we look around the world, I don't think we can easily escape this. And what we have in the Genesis story of Adam and Eve is, a representation of this. I don't think we can easily translate it into what I'm saying, but it's the same sort of thing, that Adam and Eve started off in a perfectly created situation, but things went wrong. Now, here, there are a lot of points of view, because I don't know whether this happened to a few individuals, and they're just true, a real Adam and Eve. I'm not particularly advocating that, but people do suggest it, or were just many people, maybe a whole tribe were uplifted spiritually like this, or maybe everyone at that particular point in time. When did this happen? Well, we might well think about this so-called middle to upper Paleolithic point, some, let us say, 60,000 years ago. It might have been 70,000, but that kind of figure. And it's an interesting possibility. Now, if you want to read a lot of discussion about this, there are books. Lauren Harsmer, When Did Sin Begin? Would be one place to start. And I don't want to be very categorical about this. I think it's quite uncertain. But something of the sort, I suggest, happens. And without it, we would not have real moral awareness. So now about original sin. As I said, we are fallen from our intended human condition. but we still retain many traces of it, such as conscience. I don't believe in total depravity. I do believe that there's an awful lot wrong with us, but those who have sense of moral right and wrong, even if it's a bit confused, and those who have a conscience, which is nearly all people, there are exceptions, still have at some level in their hearts a notion of natural law. And what is original sin is in fact the state of our species being degraded from our true and intended planned state of relationship with God. If we didn't have this, life would be a lot nicer, and we would be, cooperating with God in all the things that we do. We would get a lot of grace to help us through difficulties. But unfortunately, this has fallen away. And it means that we're now, let us say, overly controlled by our evolved animal condition. So that's what's left. And it has various bad effects, as we no doubt know. Greed, the disorderly appetites, which Aquinas referred to, our appetites would be ordered if we were still in proper touch with God. And here at the bottom is a depiction from an American museum of poor old Adam toiling away while it seems that Eve is impatiently calling him into dinner. This is just supposed to indicate that we exist in a condition which isn't what we might have chosen. Now, what I've just said is not very original. And if you doubt that, turn to the Church of England 39 Articles, number 9, and you'll find something very similar to what is written there, but it was written before we knew about evolution. In other words, I'm not saying that original sin is something juridical. It's to do with our relationship with God. So that is what I'm saying, and it's apparently what the Church of England Articles also say. Well, we could well do with looking at some relevant biblical verses. And people often quote from Genesis chapters 1 to 4, but Genesis 5 is very, very relevant. Genesis 5 seems to take over from where Genesis 1 stops. So Genesis 5 says, when God created man, he made him the likeness of God, as it says in Genesis 1. He made them male and female and blessed them. Then it goes on to say that Adam had a son in his own likeness, his own image, and he named him Seth. So the qualities that God gave to Adam are, at least to some extent, passed on to Adam's son Seth. He was in the image of his father, chip up the old block, and you can't say that, as it were, the image of God that was placed into people originally that just completely disappeared. No, that's not true. At least it's not what Genesis 5 would have us believe. And Paul wrote in Romans 2, when Gentiles who do not have the law, that is the law of Moses, do by nature things that are required by the law, they show that the requirements of the law are written in their hearts. And this is a well-quoted verse which says that Paul would have assented to some notion of natural law, that Gentiles, at least in principle, can know what is right and wrong and act on it. But of course, he adds later on that the Christians have taken off the new self, we would say the evolved self with its practices, and we've put on a new self. So Christianity is about renewal of our human nature. And that, of course, is a bit of a challenge to us, but that is what it should be like. The new self is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. So the image of God in us is, as Paul teaches, being renewed if we follow the way of Christ. And that is the teaching. The image of God is there, degraded, but needs to be renewed. So this, I think, sort of sums up what I think is the Christian teaching. There's a lot more to say. Now, what I've said so far is very basic, and we haven't got time to talk about all the implications of natural law in us. I'm just going to outline where I think this leads. We have God-given inclinations towards well-functioning human nature. We've spoken about human nature. We've said that it's reasonable to talk about human nature, but these inclinations are imperfectly present in us now. The natural law simply states that we ought to recognize these inclinations to be good and follow them. They are, unfortunately, in conflict with many of those of the flesh, so we need guidance, and scriptures will offer this. Now, I think that Aquinas underplayed this. He was rather optimistic about human nature, but this basically is not in conflict with what he says. And I think there are three areas of ethics that you can point out that can be led by natural law, apart from scriptural teachings. One is social. A society should be marked by honesty. It should be marked by fair laws. It should be marked by unbiased courts and by regard for the poor. All of this you will find in the Old Testament. And it's not that the Old Testament prophets, for example, point to a particular verse, the law of Moses. It is just taken for granted that if you're in tune with the law of Moses, this is the kind of society you will have. As regards our own personal character, we should avoid character defects, which no doubt we have or tend to have, but they should be avoided. The 7 deadly sins, which I won't go into, are a list of what you might call character defects: gluttony, laziness, etc., etc. So we should avoid these, and natural law will tell us surely that these characteristics aren't right. And it also includes respect for our physical nature, which we can't ignore. We can't just go in for what the physical nature might want. This includes things like good sexual conduct. So here I would say are, in very brief summary, the kind of things that natural law will lead towards if we take note of it. Now, I found the other day a web article from the BBC, and that is worth looking at, because the BBC aren't particularly religious, but this indicates their concerns that our society is falling into moral decay. Well, we might well say that in our present society, religious practice and belief are falling away. So what do you expect? Certainly worthwhile taking a look at what the BBC journalist has to say about the matter. So finally, I'll just present a summing up. Natural law is an inner sense of human direction. In fact, I think I'll just leave it here. We're running out of time a bit, and you can read through this, and we can take questions if you have them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Why don't we start with an online question? Thank you. You are making the case for humans having an innate moral code. I have many years of school teaching experience, and there's something about a group of teenagers being together which seems to make them forget their moral compass. Can you comment on why this might be?
Yes. I'm not a school teacher, and I'm sure there are lots of nice teenagers as well. But as I say, things have gone wrong, and it's not just an individual thing, it's a societal thing. If groups of school children get together and decide that it's fun to do wrong, then in the absence of a strong sense of natural law, maybe they'll do that. It is indeed part of our fallen nature. I can't really say more than that.
Thank you. So we have a question in the room. I'm going to come to you as well.
Thank you indeed for that. It was very good to have this talk on the feast day of Thomas Aquinas. So that was great. The point when I part company with you is the idea that there's a fall. Because creation was never completed, creation has continued to evolve and continued, in simple terms, to go wrong, not replicate itself exactly, since the dawn of time. And that is the kind of world that we have. We may have an idea of perfection, but there isn't one and never has been one. And Jesus didn't believe in one. In St. John chapter 5, he explains to people why he thinks it's perfectly permissible to do good and do work on the Sabbath. And he says that the creation was not completed in 6 days. God is still working. He never had a day off, and he hasn't had a day off since.
Okay, I understand what you say, and it's a point of view which I think a lot of people would hold. But firstly, it's one thing to say that God finished the work of creation. It's another thing to say that God hasn't done anything since then. Those are two separate things, and certainly the Jewish teaching is that God finished the basic creation within a period of time, and that was that. But the Jewish scriptures and others have never said that God is not active. That I would put to you is another matter. As for continuously evolving morality, I agree it's a good question. I'm not convinced that what we know about human nature and human history is very encouraging there. I'm just not convinced. People in ancient times were good and bad, same as us today. But that's how I see it. You may not see it in the same way, but that's how I see it.
There's another question. I'm going to switch between questions in the room and online. It's an online question. If God can physically create us gradually through evolution without the need for a particular intervention, why can't the moral sense also emerge gradually and sometimes imperfectly? Why is a particular divine intervention required in the Upper Paleolithic? We can still speak of particular revelation of moral values, but that's different from natural law.
Okay, I don't insist on any particular point in time when God came in, but I would liken this intervention to be to the day of Pentecost, when suddenly something started off that was new among a small group of people. That would be the parallel. I'm not convinced that you can say, well, this year they're going to be told not to commit adultery. Next year they'll be told not to steal others' possessions, and a few years later they'll be told not to kill each other. I think it's a simpler concept, if God is acting, to say that God did everything at once. I mean, that's how I see it. You may not agree, but that's how I see it.
Another question.
Thank you for your talk. I still don't quite understand why you have to bring God into the question about morals. Sure, it's just a simple answer is the golden rule. Don't do to others that you don't want to have done to yourselves. That's a universal, surely. When you bring God and religion in, it just matters the water. You've got to consider how horrible things are happening in the world at the moment. Take the Israeli Defense Force, who are considering themselves as the most moral army in the world, but in fact, I would consider the most amoral army in the world. At least they're higher command. And this is from a country that regards themselves as based on religion.
Well, we certainly don't always get our understanding of God's will right, that's for sure. But as for the golden rule, as I understand it, people like Aristotle would have said, well, you can be too lazy or you can be not lazy enough. There's something, a happy mean, and you can do that. As a way of life, people can do that. I'm not convinced that it works. I think that even if Aristotle says this, you've still got to say, well, ought I to behave like this? Or am I just choosing what is a convenient way for myself? I'm not sure that Aristotle, I hope I've got the right philosopher, would have said that the golden rule is something that you can easily apply to societies. And I'm not sure, this was more like, the 7 deadly sins, the personal characteristics which will make you happier if you follow them, which is well good because there's no conflict between saying that this is a practically useful way of behaving and that God would like us to do that. But if you just didn't follow golden rules because it was convenient not to, if you thought that I've got the power, I can be greedy, you've got to have a way of saying that this is actually wrong, not just that for me, I can be as greedy as I like because I can get away with it. So I think there are problems here, but that's not to say that golden rules are without value. I don't think they're enough.
Yes, you come over here.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to note that you mentioned that there were some exceptions to the idea that most humans, albeit having a slightly flawed human nature, still have this idea of a conscience. Wouldn't these exceptions imply that this idea of an absolute human nature isn't completely absolute?
Well, of course, there are people, we're told, who are sort of completely antisocial. They don't have consciences. They are defective. But this is exceptional. There's somebody who just thinks, okay, in my way, I'll shoot them. This is not normal or good. Otherwise, I may have missed the rest of your question. Could you say it again?
Yeah, so with these sort of antisocial types, wouldn't that imply that this idea of an absolute morality or natural law intrinsic in everyone isn't necessarily intrinsic in everyone? Wouldn't this be a clear exception?
It would say that there are people for whom God's law in their hearts have got a bit lost and they are morally blind. I don't know what to say. There are people who are apparently like that. So what should be for everyone, somehow there are people who are physically disabled, people who are born without sight, but we wouldn't say that having sight is somehow optional. There's something that has gone wrong. Things do go wrong. I don't know why it happens quite like this, but I think that it does. There is an absolute standard, but it somehow gets lost sometimes.
Yeah, there were quite a lot of hands still.
Thank you, Peter.
I'm just wondering whether natural law, there's a further stage, as it were. Does Jesus himself add something to natural law? After all, an eye for an eye, a quid pro quo, is there as a common factor amongst lots of societies. But Jesus says, if you are angry with your brother, you committed murder, liable and so on. And he turn the other cheek and so on.
I think we need to think a lot about Jesus' statements, because he sometimes seems to say different things. On the one hand, not one iota of the law of Moses will pass away. On the other hand, later on, or even earlier, he says, you've heard it said this, but I say to you that. So you're right to ask the question, and I don't think it's an easy one to give a quick answer to. It is to do with the way that some laws of society were given to the Jewish people because it was convenient, like divorce laws. Moses said, here's some rules to follow with divorce, but Jesus pointed out that there's a basic law that men and women were supposed to come together and permanently, and that is really a higher law than what was given to the people of Israel for their own convenience. So that's a fact you've got to fold into this.
Okay, can I ask one more question online? So this is about the role of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Was that the source of moral authority, but also the source of original sin? Is there a paradox here?
I personally find it very difficult to know quite what to make of all of this. I would say I probably diverged from the details of that story, but remember that there was a disobedience. There was an incursion of evil, a Satan in form of a snake, and he persuaded Eve and then Adam to be disobedient. But up to that point, they would have eaten of the tree of life. But then God says to them, well, this is too dangerous now. You'll have to go away from the Garden of Eden and fend for yourselves a bit more, rather than having all of this given to you directly from me, as it were. Now, it was something to do with human beings deciding to make their own rules about what was good and bad, except they were given this idea that the apple, or whatever fruit it was good to eat and very nice, and why don't you try it? So the perception of good and evil was distorted, and then there was a disobedience. But I think that's all I can easily say about the Genesis story. There are hidden depths of spirituality in it. I don't want to try to say more, because I'm not sure that I have these insights, but it's all obviously worth thinking about a lot.
Well, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for. Let's just give a round of applause for our speaker.